Medieval justice was as brutal as it was paradoxical, a blend of faith, violence, and tradition. Imagine standing in a medieval court where your fate wasn't decided by evidence or testimony, but by combat. In this world, guilt or innocence hinged on strength, skill, and the will of God. This is the story of the judicial duel, a terrifying ritual where life and death walked hand in hand with justice. Our tale begins in 1127, with the shocking murder of Charles the Good, the Count of Flanders. Found slain at the altar of a church, his blood pooled on sacred ground as the court sought retribution. A band of knights, bound by oaths of treachery, were swiftly arrested, tortured, and executed. Yet suspicion fell on one man, Guy of Steinborg, a knight accused of sheltering one of the conspirators, his brother-in-law Isaac. Amidst the chaos, Hermann the Iron, a loyal knight to Charles, stepped forward to accuse Guy of aiding the murderers. Hermann challenged Guy to a judicial duel, a trial by combat meant to determine his guilt or innocence. Refusing the challenge would mean certain condemnation, so Guy accepted, wagering his life on the strength of his sword and his faith in divine justice. Judicial duels were no mere brawls. They were rituals steeped in symbolism and belief. In the medieval mind, victory in combat was proof of divine favor, and defeat was an undeniable mark of guilt. Crowds of peasants and nobles gathered to witness the duel, a spectacle as much as it was a trial. Both knights prepared, donning chainmail and mounting their war horses. The makeshift arena became a stage for faith, violence, and the grim pursuit of justice. As the duel began, the knights charged, their lances poised to strike. The thunder of hooves echoed as Guy unhorsed Hermann with a decisive thrust. Each time Hermann attempted to rise, Guy circled him, jabbing with his lance, keeping him on the defensive. But Hermann was no ordinary foe. With a calculated counterattack, he struck down Guy's horse, forcing both knights to fight on foot. The combat escalated into a brutal melee. Swords clashed, shields were discarded, and iron gauntlets flew in savage blows. The crowd watched in tense silence as the knights battered one another. Guy gained the upper hand, delivering relentless strikes to Hermann's face with his gauntlet. But in a moment of desperation, Hermann grabbed Guy by an unprotected area of his armor and hurled him to the ground with a devastating move. Crippled and defeated, Guy cried out in pain, admitting his guilt. The crowd roared as Hermann, bloodied but victorious, stood tall. For Guy, justice came swiftly and without mercy. He was hanged alongside another conspirator, his broken body left as a grim warning to all who would defy the law. Medieval Europe was a land of contradictions. While it revered divine justice, chivalry, and faith, it also embraced brutal customs like trial by combat. Knights were sworn to protect the weak, yet their code often led to acts of unspeakable violence. Even the church denounced these duels as unholy spectacles, though it failed to eradicate them. For centuries, judicial combat persisted, blending fear, faith, and savagery into one of the most extreme forms of medieval justice. This practice wasn't limited to knights. Women, clerics, and even children could face combat, often hiring champions to fight on their behalf. In rare and chilling cases, women fought directly in marital disputes where husbands were handicapped, forced to stand in a ditch with one arm tied behind their back. Defeated husbands faced execution, while their wives were buried alive. Justice in medieval times was as unyielding as it was merciless. Stripped of its chivalric ideals, the medieval duel revealed its raw brutality. It was not a stage for valor or honor, but a grim fight for survival. For knights like Hermann, victory meant glory and divine vindication, but the cost was evident in the blood-soaked fields and shattered bodies left behind. For Guy, justice ended in disgrace, his broken form hanging for the jeering crowds of peasants. The story of trial by combat offers a glimpse into the medieval mind, a world where the sword and lance didn't just defend honor but decided fate itself. It was a terrifying ritual that blended faith and violence, justice and cruelty, and left a legacy both fascinating and horrifying. Knights, with their shining armor and banners of loyalty, were the embodiment of medieval ideals. Yet beneath this polished exterior lay a world of pragmatic brutality. While they were often romanticized as protectors of the weak, their lives were just as often consumed by conflict, bloodshed, and the rigid enforcement of a hierarchical society. Justice, for these warriors, was a battlefield as much as it was a courtroom. Trial by combat was not merely a test of physical prowess. it was a deeply symbolic act. The combatants entered the field believing, or at least professing to believe, that the outcome would reflect the will of God. Yet, for all its divine pretense, the duel was also a stark reminder of human frailty. A skilled fighter could sway the judgment of heaven, and luck or treachery could just as easily turn the tide. The concept of justice in the medieval world often hinged on fear and spectacle. Public executions, duels, and tortures were as much about reinforcing social order as they were about punishment. The crowds that gathered to watch knights clash in judicial combat or peasants jeer at a condemned man dangling from a noose were witnesses to a grim ritual, a collective reinforcement of the rules that bound their fractured society. This need for order stemmed from the precarious nature of life in medieval Europe. Political instability, disease, and famine loomed large over the populace, creating a world where control had to be exerted by force or divine authority. Trials by combat fit perfectly into this paradigm, blending martial strength with a semblance of spiritual approval. To challenge the outcome of such a duel was not just to question the victor, but to question the will of God. Yet, even within this rigid framework, contradictions abounded. The knightly code of chivalry, often romanticized in modern times, was rarely as pure in practice as it was in theory. Knights might swear oaths to defend the helpless and uphold justice, but these same oaths often permitted, if not demanded, violence against perceived enemies, be they other knights, bandits, or heretics. The line between hero and oppressor was thin and often blurred. For the common people, knights were figures of both admiration and fear. To see a knight in full armor was to witness the height of martial and social power, yet their presence could just as easily spell ruin. A duel might be a thrilling spectacle for peasants, but the larger conflicts that knights waged often left towns burned, fields trampled, and communities devastated. Justice, from the perspective of the powerless, was frequently indistinguishable from tyranny. Even the church, an institution deeply intertwined with medieval life, struggled with the morality of trial by combat. Many clerics denounced the practice as barbaric and irreligious, arguing that God's judgment could not be invoked through such violent means. Yet others saw duels as a necessary evil, a way to resolve disputes in a world where impartial evidence was scarce and trust in human witnesses was tenuous at best. Despite its brutality, trial by combat carried a strange kind of fairness. In a society where birth and status often determined one's fate, the duel offered a rare opportunity for an individual, regardless of rank, to prove their worth or face divine condemnation. This illusion of fairness, however, often crumbled in practice. Wealth and connections could secure better armor, training, or even a hired champion, tipping the scales long before the duel began. The duel also reflected a deep belief in the material manifestation of divine justice. The medieval world was one where the sacred and the profane were intertwined. A church altar might host both a knight's solemn oath and a bloody brawl. To modern eyes, this paradox may seem incomprehensible, but to medieval minds, it was perfectly logical. Faith and violence were not opposites. They were two sides of the same coin, each reinforcing the other's authority. As we look back on these brutal practices, it is tempting to view them as relics of a barbaric past. Yet the medieval duel reveals more than just the violence of the age. It uncovers a profound human struggle to impose meaning and order on a chaotic world. For knights like Hermann the Iron and Guy of Steinborg, the duel was not just a fight for survival. It was a fight for identity, honor, and a place within the divine narrative of their time. Ultimately, the story of trial by combat is not only about the past, but also about the timeless human desire for justice, even in its most flawed and brutal forms. It reminds us that history, with all its contradictions, is a mirror reflecting the complexities of human nature, both noble and savage, driven by faith yet tethered to violence. Through this lens, the medieval duel becomes more than an artifact of history. It becomes a story of humanity itself.